So there's a very interesting book I read called The Secular Age by Charles Taylor. And it's one of the hardest books I've read, but it's a history of why Western religion died since the Middle Ages. And so he stacks it up to a couple different things. The first is technological progress. That's obvious. The second thing is that religion stopped being fun. Where back in the Middle Ages, religion, the church would throw parties. It would give
really
like people would party at church in the Middle Ages.
They didn't have orgies though, like in ancient Greece.
No, they didn't. People did have. This is one of the weirdest facts. People did have sex in public in the Middle Ages because there wasn't a concept of privacy. Yeah,
interesting.
Yeah, the church was not. The church in the Middle Ages put sexual sins on the lower rung. So like pride was a worse sin than fornication. The church sponsored brothels in the Middle Ages. So it's a very different society. And the church would also, it gave people over a month of days off every year. So the church would you'd have a day off or a saint's day at least once a week. So it was just, the church was more fun. And what happened was the middle classes took over the church, and the middle classes made church really boring. That's thing two. Thing three is that governments realized the church wasn't in their self-interest, where governments realized to themselves, if we remove God, we can't be held to standards because God is something that holds us to standards to control the people. If we want total power, we should just remove God because the people will make the state the God then. And so you saw the turn of elites realizing that it was inside their self-interest to get rid of religion. And the fourth thing is the church experienced a lot of brain drain with back in the Middle Ages, the smart people went into the church. Now they go into business or content creating or tech or finance. And so you had lots of generations of people with the church not getting society's best. And you also removed the concept of a magical universe, where back in the Middle Ages, it's like my friend who used to live in Cambodia. In certain societies, magic is just part of your life. Witchcraft is as obvious as a bridge. Fairies you just believe in fairies and dragons and that stuff. And when you remove that kind of world, you remove the kind of intellectual framework where that kind of Christianity makes sense.
I think drugs were a huge part of it.
Oh, yeah.
I think what Brian Marescu talks about, what classicists like Carl Ruck talk about, where these experiences that they were having, where they would often describe them as being the most important experiences of their lives, where they could literally see the fabric of the universe. And that's what they thought God was.
Yes.
Something that you could experience through these drugs.
I agree on the psychedelics bit, where I am one of the very few people whose area of speciality is the Middle Ages who will agree with that, but I do. But we have primary sources from the Middle Ages of the church made peasants take the Eucharist at least once a year because the peasants were terrified to take the Eucharist. The peasants, they said the magic of the church was so strong it was scary. That doesn't make sense if it's wine. It does make sense if it's psychedelic. And so once you think of it this way, the church is making peasants trip at least once a year. That completely changes the dynamic of taking the Eucharist.
In what year?
This is like 1200.
1200 AD.
Yeah, so I put the event. This is something Moresco studied more than me. Moresco's a classicist. He's not a medievalist. And so he puts the end of using psychedelics for the church around 400. I put it around like 1200s, 1300s, because we have records from the 1100s.
You're saying people like Brian Marescu, classicists, don't go past 400?
No, that's one of the. Having read his book, I don't see him reference I don't see him reference that much stuff past the ancient world. From reading that book, I don't remember him ever talking about the Middle Ages. But we have records from the Middle Ages from the 1100s in northern France of people taking psychedelics, and we also have records from I think 1200s England of peasants being scared to take the Eucharist. So I think it did go on later, and I think it was during the 1200s, the church became completely morally corrupt, where I visited, so the King of France killed the Pope, and then he made an alternate Pope in France. And I was visiting the location for that alternate Pope's residence in Avignon in the south of France. And I had a joke, every single room in this palace is either a feasting hall or a place to store gold. I did not find a single chapel in Avignon. And the reputation for reading at that time period is the Pope in the 1300s, they were just complete degenerates. And the reason Protestantism showed up was that the church was taking in all this money to build St. Florence's Cathedral and to fund all this degenerate Renaissance art and for the Pope to have a bunch of mistresses. And the Germans thought, why the hell are we giving you money to be degenerates? And that's what caused the Protestant Reformation. So my guess, and I would need to study this topic significantly more to give an educated opinion on it, is that at some point from like 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council, and then the Black Death, that they phased out psychedelics. And it wouldn't surprise me if it's a gradualistic thing, because the church was doing all these very strategic power maneuvers, and their whole thing was they're trying to clasp down on heretics, because Western Europe was infiltrated. They had all these organizations like the Cathars or the Waldensians. And so the church was launching, or the Hussites, the church was launching all of these crusades against heretics. And the heretics all had different views on Christianity. So my guess would be that the church phased out the use of psychedelics so that the heretics wouldn't get more information, because the church stopped liking like private revelation, where St. Francis of Assisi was part of the Franciscans, where they were a mystic group, and the mystics, they talked to God personally and all that stuff. St. Francis of Assisi, he was nearly labeled a heretic, and he wasn't against the Catholic Church. They were just scared of new ideas. And the thing is, the Franciscans saved Catholicism during that time period because the church needed to take in at least some free thinkers to fight off the heretics. But my guess, and again, I'm not an expert in this field, my guess would be that at some point in the 12 or the 1300s, they gradually phased out psychedelics to combat heresy. And because by the time Martin Luther shows up in 1500, I see no records of this. But, so one of the interesting topics I've looked into is the history of mental illness. So there are very few records of autism or schizophrenia from the pre-industrial world, but you do get illnesses like everyone in a town breaking out into dancing for hours straight, or you get demonic possession or witchcraft. And so you get what we've found from the studies is that people in late medieval France and Germany would just randomly break into dancing after the Black Death. And that was influenced by ergot. And so we know that the random dancing was by ergot. And so if that's actually a theory, that ergot in the wine is what got people to dance. And so how you get an entire town to be infested with Eucharist, this is a society where literally everyone goes to church. So if they're drinking ergot-infested wine and breaking into dancing, that's the only reasonable explanation for the dancing towns of the 1300s that I know of.
Interesting. Yeah. And then you come to today, which is what leads us to what we've been talking about before, and drugs are outcast from society and illegal, and basically explains why so many people are incarcerated in the country, and it's like we've devolved so far from the origin of all of this stuff.